When 24-year-old Elena Hartwell stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Millbrook Valley after 15 years away, she carried nothing but a worn leather satchel and secrets that could shatter the carefully constructed lies an entire town had built around her supposed death. The girl who had vanished during the Great Fire of 1868 had returned as a woman shaped by sawdust and spotlights, but the homecoming she'd dreamed of would become a nightmare that would test everything she believed about family, forgiveness, and the price of truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves through the streets of Millbrook Valley as Elena Hartwell stood frozen on the wooden platform of the general store, staring at a sight that made her blood run cold. There, carved into a weathered granite headstone in the small cemetery visible from Main Street, were the words that changed everything. Elena Margaret Hartwell, beloved daughter, 1853-1868, taken too soon by fire. She pressed her trembling fingers against the rough bark of an oak tree, trying to steady herself as the full weight of what she was seeing crashed over her like a river breaking through a dam. For 15 years, she had carried the hope of returning home to Millbrook Valley, the small frontier town nestled in the Colorado Territory, where she had been born and spent the first 9 years of her life. She had imagined 100 different scenarios for her homecoming, but never once had she considered that her own family might have declared her dead and buried an empty coffin in her name. The memories came flooding back with painful clarity. The night everything changed had started like any other evening in the Hartwell household. Her father, Thomas Hartwell, had been working late in his carpentry shop attached to the back of their modest home on Elm Street. Her mother, Margaret, had been preparing supper while humming the Irish lullabies that always made Eleanor feel safe and loved. 9-year-old Elena had been sitting at the kitchen table, carefully practicing her letters in the copybook her mother had made from scraps of brown paper sewn together with thread. The first sign of trouble had been the acrid smell of smoke drifting through the evening air. Thomas had emerged from his workshop with concern etched across his weathered face, his carpenter's apron still tied around his waist and wood shavings clinging to his dark hair. He had stepped outside to investigate, leaving the door open so that the orange glow from the direction of Miller's grain warehouse became visible even from their kitchen window. Within minutes, the volunteer fire brigade was racing through the streets with their hand-pumped engine, shouting warnings for everyone to prepare for the worst. The autumn had been unusually dry, and the wooden buildings of Millbrook Valley were like kindling waiting for a spark. What had started as a small fire in the grain warehouse was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, jumping from building to building with hungry efficiency. Elena remembered the confusion and terror that had followed. Her parents had rushed to gather their most precious possessions, while the sound of shouting men and clanging bells filled the air. Thomas had grabbed his toolbox and the small wooden chest where he kept the family's savings, while Margaret had frantically stuffed clothing and photographs into a carpet bag. Elena had been told to wait by the front door, clutching her favorite doll, a cloth creation her mother had sewn with button eyes and yarn hair. The last clear memory she had of that night was standing in the doorway, watching her parents move frantically around their home, when a tremendous crash had echoed from somewhere nearby. The sound had been followed by screams and the splintering of wood, and then everything had gone black. When she had awakened, she was lying in the back of a circus wagon, miles from Millbrook Valley, with no memory of how she had gotten there. Marcus Bellwether, the owner of Bellwether's traveling circus and menagerie, had found her unconscious in a field outside of town, her clothes singed and her face streaked with soot. He was a kind man with gentle eyes and calloused hands, who, spoke with a slight accent that Elena later learned was from his childhood in Ireland. Marcus had told her that he and his troop had been camped several miles from Millbrook Valley when they saw the orange glow of the fire lighting up the night sky. He had ridden toward town to offer assistance, but by the time he arrived, the fire had already consumed nearly half the buildings, and chaos reigned in the streets. He had discovered Elena lying in a field between the town and his camp, apparently thrown clear of some building or wagon by the force of an explosion. She had been alone, unconscious, and clearly in need of immediate medical attention. With no way to identify her and no one in the burning town able to tell him who she belonged to, Marcus had made the decision to take her back to his camp and care for her until she recovered enough to tell them where she lived. But Elena's recovery had been complicated by more than just her physical injuries. The trauma of that night had stolen large pieces of her memory, leaving her with fragments of images and emotions, but no clear recollection of her full name, her family, or exactly where she had lived. She remembered her first name, and that she had lived in a town with wooden buildings and a grain warehouse, but the details that would have helped Marcus return her to her family remained locked away in her damaged mind. Marcus had spent weeks traveling through the territory, stopping at every town and settlement, describing Elena to anyone who would listen and hoping to find someone who recognized her. But his search had yielded nothing. No one reported a missing child matching her description, and the few people who thought she looked familiar couldn't place her with any certainty. After 2 months of fruitless searching, Marcus had made the decision to take Elena with the circus permanently, becoming her guardian and giving her a new family among the performers and workers who made their living traveling from town to town. The circus had become Elena's world, and she had adapted to the nomadic lifestyle with the resilience that only children possess. Marcus had treated her as his own daughter, teaching her to read and write with greater skill than she had possessed. Before her accident, she had learned arithmetic from Sophia, the fortune-teller who managed the circus's finances with mathematical precision that belied her mystical persona. She had absorbed geography and history from the diverse collection of performers who had joined their troupe over the years, each bringing stories and knowledge from different parts of the country and the world. As she grew older, Elena had discovered her own talents within the circus family. She had natural grace and balance that made her an excellent tightrope walker, and her fearless nature had allowed her to work with the horses and other animals with remarkable skill. But her greatest gift had been her ability to connect with audiences, to tell stories and perform dramatic recitations that could move crowds to tears or laughter with equal ease. By the time she was 16, Elena was one of the most popular performers in Bellwether's traveling circus, known throughout the territory for her daring acrobatic displays and her captivating stage presence. Yet, despite the love and acceptance she had found with the circus, Elena had never stopped wondering about her original family. As her memories slowly returned in pieces over the years, she had begun to recall more details about her life before the fire. She remembered her mother's voice singing Irish songs, her father's gentle hands teaching her to whittle small figures from wood scraps, and the feeling of safety and belonging that had defined her early childhood. Most importantly, she had eventually remembered the name of her hometown, Millbrook Valley, Colorado Territory. For years, Elena had planned to return to Millbrook Valley to search for any surviving family members and to learn the truth about what had happened during the fire. But circus life had a way of making such plans difficult to execute. There was always another town to visit, another performance to prepare for, another crisis that required immediate attention. Marcus had grown older and more dependent on her. Skills as both a performer and a manager and Elena had felt obligated to remain with the man who had saved her life and given her a home when she had no one else. The decision to finally return to Millbrook Valley had been forced upon her by Marcus's death 6 months earlier. The man who had been her father in every way that mattered had succumbed to pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter in Wyoming, leaving Elena not only heartbroken but also uncertain about her future. The circus had been sold to pay debts, and the performers had scattered to find new employment with other traveling shows or to settle down in permanent homes. For the first time since she was 9 years old, Elena had found herself truly alone in the world, with no family, no job, and no clear direction for her future. It was then that she had decided to honor the promise she had made to herself years earlier to return to Millbrook Valley and discover the truth about her past. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had used her savings from 15 years of performing to purchase passage on the stagecoach, carrying with her only the few possessions that held the most meaning: a photograph of Marcus and the Circus family, her performance costumes, and a small wooden horse that her father had carved for her before the fire, one of the few clear memories that had survived her trauma. Now, standing in the town where she had been born, staring at her own gravestone, Elena felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted fundamentally. The homecoming she had imagined for so many years had included reunions with surviving family members, explanations about what had happened during the fire, and perhaps even forgiveness for the years of separation that had been beyond her control. She had never considered the possibility that her family might believe she was dead, or that her return might be seen as something supernatural or threatening rather than joyful. The sound of approaching footsteps on the wooden sidewalk made Elena turn away from the cemetery view, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to compose herself for whatever confrontation might be coming. A middle-aged woman was walking toward the general store with the purposeful stride of someone who had important business to conduct. As she drew closer, Elena felt a shock of recognition that nearly brought her to her knees. Despite the lines around her eyes and the grey streaks in her brown hair, Elena knew immediately that she was looking at her mother. Margaret Hartwell had survived the fire, but the years had clearly taken their toll on her. She moved with the careful gait of someone who had suffered significant injuries, and her face bore the kind of permanent sadness that comes from losing a child. She was dressed in the practical clothing of a frontier woman, but Elena could see that the fabric was of good quality and well maintained, suggesting that the family had rebuilt their lives with reasonable success after the disaster that had taken their daughter. Elena's first instinct was to rush forward and throw her arms around her mother to sob out 15 years of longing and separation in one overwhelming embrace. But something held her back, a warning instinct that told her such a direct approach might not be wise. Instead, she stepped partially behind the oak tree, using its broad trunk to conceal herself while she observed her mother's approach to the store. Margaret entered the general store with a brief nod to the clerk, her manner suggesting that this was a routine visit rather than a special occasion. Elena could hear the murmur of conversation through the open door, though she couldn't make out the specific words being exchanged. What she could observe was the clerk's deferential manner toward her mother, and the way other customers in the store seemed to treat Margaret with a combination of respect and sympathy that spoke volumes about her standing in the community. After several minutes, Margaret emerged from the store, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. As she walked back down Main Street toward the residential area of town, Elena found herself following at a distance, drawn by an irresistible need to see where her mother lived and how she had rebuilt her life after the tragedy that had separated them. The house that Margaret approached was not the modest home on Elm Street where Eleanor had spent her early childhood. This was a larger, more substantial dwelling on Maple Avenue, with a well-maintained garden and fresh paint that spoke of prosperity and careful attention to detail. A sign in the front yard identified it as Hartwell Boarding House, and Eleanor could see several people moving about inside, suggesting that her mother had found a way to support herself by taking in lodgers. As Margaret climbed the front steps and disappeared through the door, Eleanor felt a complex mixture of relief and confusion. Her mother had clearly survived the fire and had managed to build a successful business in the years since. But the existence of Elena's gravestone suggested that Margaret believed her daughter was dead, which raised troubling questions about what exactly had happened during and after the fire. If Margaret was alive and prospering, why had no one ever come looking for Elena? Why had Marcus's extensive search failed to locate anyone who claimed her as family? The answer to these questions came from an unexpected source. As Elena stood on the sidewalk, trying to decide how to approach her mother, she heard a familiar voice calling her name from behind. She turned to see a man in his 30s approaching with a mixture of shock and disbelief written across his weathered features. It took her a moment to recognize him as David Sullivan, who had been several years older than her when they were children, but who had occasionally played with her when their families attended the same church services. "Elena Hartwell," David said, his voice barely above a whisper as he stopped a few feet away from her. "Sweet Jesus, is it really you? We buried you 15 years ago. How are you standing here talking to me?" The directness of his question forced Elena to confront the reality of her situation. She was not just returning home after a long absence. She was returning from the dead, at least in the minds of everyone who had known her as a child. The implications of this realization were staggering and would require careful navigation if she hoped to rebuild relationships with her surviving family and community. "I didn't die in the fire, David," Elena said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't, attracting attention from other townspeople. "I was injured and lost my memory. A circus owner found me and cared for me, but by the time I remembered who I was and where I came from, years had passed. I've been traveling with the circus ever since, but I finally decided to come home and find my family." David's expression shifted from shock to something that might have been suspicion or concern. "Elena, your parents grieved for you something terrible. Your mother nearly died herself from the injuries she sustained trying to find you in the burning house. Your father searched for weeks, even after the sheriff told him there was no hope. They found pieces of your dress in the wreckage and assumed you'd been consumed by the flames. The whole town attended your funeral." The pain in David's voice made Eleanor's chest tighten with guilt and regret. She had never considered how her disappearance might have affected her parents emotionally, or how the uncertainty about her fate might have prolonged their suffering. In her mind, she had always assumed that her family would be waiting for her return with joy and relief. The reality was clearly far more complicated. "Where is my father?" Eleanor asked, though something in David's expression already suggested she might not want to hear the answer. David looked away, his discomfort obvious. "Thomas died 3 years ago, Eleanor. The grief and the drinking that followed your supposed death finally caught up with him. He never got over losing you, and he never stopped believing that somehow he could have saved you if he'd been stronger or faster or smarter. Your mother tried everything to help him, but he just couldn't find a way to live with the guilt." The news hit Elena like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her legs suddenly unsteady. Her father was dead, and his death had been hastened by grief over her disappearance. If she had returned sooner, if she had found a way to contact her family earlier, Thomas Hartwell might still be alive. The weight of this knowledge settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket, heavy and cold and impossible to ignore. Your mother never remarried, David continued, his voice gentle with sympathy. She threw herself into building that boarding house business, partly to support herself and partly to stay busy enough that she wouldn't think too much about what she'd lost. She's become something of a pillar in the community, helping other families who've faced tragedies and hardships. But she's never been the same woman she was before the fire. Elena felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back. She had not traveled hundreds of miles and spent her last savings to return home, only to collapse in self-pity on the streets of Millbrook Valley. If her mother was alive and building a meaningful life, then Elena owed it to both of them to find a way to reconnect, regardless of how difficult the process might prove to be. "I need to see her," Elena said, straightening her shoulders with determination. "I need to tell her what happened and apologize for the years of grief I caused, even though it wasn't intentional." David shook his head slowly, his expression troubled. "Elena, you don't understand how this is going to affect people. Your return isn't just a family matter. The whole town believes you're dead. Some folks might see you as a ghost or a sign of supernatural intervention. Others might think you're an imposter trying to take advantage of your mother's success. And there are probably people who won't want to face the possibility that they were wrong about what happened during the fire." The complexity of her situation was becoming clearer with each passing minute. Elena had expected that her return might be emotional and challenging, but she hadn't anticipated that it would also be controversial or potentially dangerous. In her mind, the truth of her identity and survival would be sufficient to overcome any initial skepticism or confusion. But David's warning suggested that the reality would be far more complicated than she had imagined. "What do you think I should do?" Elena asked, genuinely seeking advice from someone who understood the community better than she did after 15 years away. David was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with conflicting impulses and loyalties. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of genuine concern. "I think you need to be very careful about how you approach this. Start with your mother, but do it privately and gently. Give her time to process the shock before you reveal yourself to the rest of the town, and be prepared for the possibility that some people might not want to accept your return, even if they believe you're really who you claim to be." As Elena considered David's advice, she noticed that their conversation had begun to attract attention from other people on the street. Several townspeople had stopped their own activities to stare in her direction, and she could see the curiosity and speculation in their expressions. Word of her presence would spread quickly through a community the size of Millbrook Valley, which meant she had limited time to approach her mother before the entire town knew about her return. "I'm going to knock on her door tonight," Elena decided, "after the boarding house guests have settled in for the evening and she has some privacy to deal with whatever emotions this brings up." David nodded approvingly. "That's probably wise. But Elena, I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm glad you survived and made it home. Your father would have been overjoyed to see you again, and I think your mother will be too, once she gets over the initial shock." As David walked away, Elena found herself alone again, with her thoughts and the overwhelming reality of what lay ahead. The simple dream of returning home had evolved into something far more complex and emotionally challenging than anything she had experienced during her 15 years with the circus. But she had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back. Now, tonight, she would knock on her mother's door and begin the process of reclaiming her place in a family and community that had buried her memory and moved on with their lives. The hours until evening stretched ahead of her like an eternity, filled with anticipation, anxiety, and the growing certainty that her homecoming would test every skill she had learned as a performer and every ounce of courage she had developed. During her years of traveling the frontier, The girl who had disappeared in the flames 15 years ago was about to discover whether the woman she had become was strong enough to bridge the gap between the dead and the living, between the past and the future, between the family she had lost and the family she hoped to reclaim. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Millbrook Valley as Elena found herself walking the familiar yet changed streets of her childhood home. Every corner held fragments of memory that surfaced like bubbles in still water, some clear and sharp, others distorted by time and trauma. The blacksmith shop where her father had once brought his tools for repair now bore a different name on its weathered sign. The church, where her family had attended Sunday services, had been rebuilt with red brick instead of the original white-painted wood, standing as a monument to the town's recovery from the devastating fire. Elena purchased a room at the Riverside Inn, a modest establishment on the opposite end of town from her mother's boarding house. The innkeeper, Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, was a woman Elena didn't recognize, which provided a small measure of relief. She registered under the name Elena Walsh, using the surname of a performer friend from the circus, and paid for 3 nights in advance. The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the livery stable, where she could observe the comings and goings of townspeople without being easily noticed herself. As evening approached, Elena prepared herself for the most important performance of her life. She changed from her travel-stained dress into the finest gown she owned, a deep blue silk creation that Sophia, the fortune-teller, had helped her sew during their winter quarters 2 years earlier. She arranged her long auburn hair in the style she remembered her mother favoring, pinned back with small combs, but allowed to fall in loose waves down her back. Looking at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, Elena could see both. The 9-year-old child, who had disappeared in the fire, and the 24-year-old woman, who had been shaped by 15 years of circus life. The walk to Maple Avenue felt like the longest journey of her life, though it covered only 6 blocks through the quiet residential streets of Millbrook Valley. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs with each step, and she found herself rehearsing what she would say when her mother opened the door. How did one announce that they had returned from the dead? How did one apologize for 15 years of grief and mourning that had been unnecessary but unavoidable? The Hartwell boarding house stood before her like a fortress of respectability, its windows glowing warmly with lamplight, and its front porch decorated with carefully tended flower boxes that spoke of a woman who had found purpose in creating beauty despite her losses. Elena could see the silhouettes of people moving about inside, guests settling in for the evening or gathering in what appeared to be a common sitting room. The normalcy of the scene made her situation feel even more surreal and challenging. Elena stood on the sidewalk for nearly 10 minutes, gathering her courage and waiting for the right moment to approach. She watched as the last of the boarding house guests retired to their rooms, leaving only the ground floor lights burning. Through the front window, she could see her mother moving about what appeared to be a kitchen, cleaning up after the evening meal and preparing for the next day's activities. Finally, when the house had settled into quiet and the street was empty of other pedestrians, Elena climbed the front steps and raised her hand to knock on the door. The sound of her knuckles against the wood seemed impossibly loud in the evening. Stillness, and she held her breath as footsteps approached from inside. The door opened to reveal Margaret Hartwell, and for a moment both women stood frozen in mutual recognition and disbelief. Margaret's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: confusion, recognition, shock, and finally a kind of terror that made her step backward as though she had seen something supernatural and threatening. "You're dead," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible as she gripped the doorframe for support. "I buried you myself. I watched them lower your coffin into the ground." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes at the pain and fear in her mother's voice. This was not the joyful reunion she had imagined, but rather a confrontation that was clearly causing Margaret genuine distress and confusion. "Mama, it's really me. I didn't die in the fire. I was hurt and lost my memory. But I'm alive. I've been alive all these years." Margaret's legs seemed to give way beneath her, and she sank onto a chair that sat just inside the front door, her face pale as moonlight, and her breathing rapid and shallow. "This isn't possible. You're 9 years old. You were wearing a blue dress with white buttons. Your hair was in braids, because I had braided it myself that morning." The specific details of Margaret's memory hit Elena like physical blows, each one a reminder of the life that had been interrupted and the mother who had carried these precise images of her lost daughter for 15 years. "I was wearing that dress, Mama, and you did braid my hair that morning. You used the blue ribbons that Papa bought for me at the summer festival." Margaret looked up at Elena with eyes that held a desperate kind of hope, warring with the fear of believing in something that might prove to be a cruel illusion. "Show me your scar." Elena had a scar on her left palm from when she cut herself on Papa's wood plane when she was 7 years old. Elena held out her left hand, revealing the thin white line that ran from her palm to her wrist, a mark she had carried since childhood and had never thought might serve as proof of her identity. Margaret stared at the scar for a long moment, then reached out with trembling fingers to trace its familiar path. "Dear God," Margaret breathed, her voice breaking with the weight of realization. "It really is you. My little girl is alive." Tatus. The next hour passed in a blur of tears, explanations and embraces that 15 years of separation had made both precious and awkward. Elena told her mother about Marcus Bellwether and the circus, about her lost memories and gradual recovery, about the years of wondering and planning to return home. Margaret shared her own story of survival, of pulling Elena's father from the burning house, of searching frantically through the wreckage for any sign of her daughter, of the slow and painful process of accepting Elena's death and learning to live with that loss. "Your father never stopped looking," Margaret said, her voice thick with old grief. "Even after we held the funeral, even after everyone else had accepted that you were gone, Thomas would ride out to neighboring towns and ask if anyone had seen a little girl with auburn hair and green eyes. He spent every spare dollar on telegraph, messages and newspaper advertisements. It nearly drove us to ruin, and it certainly drove him to drink." Elena felt the weight of guilt settle heavier on her shoulders as she understood more fully how her disappearance had destroyed her family. The man who had taught her to whittle and who had carried her on his shoulders during town parades had died of a broken heart, never knowing that his daughter was alive and thinking of him every day. "I tried to find you too, Mama. When my memories started coming back, I asked Marcus to help me search for my family, but we didn't know enough details, and by then years had passed. We visited dozens of towns, but no one remembered a missing child because everyone thought I was dead." Margaret nodded, understanding the terrible irony that had kept them separated for so long. "We stopped looking because we thought there was nothing to find. You stopped looking because there was no trace of your search to follow. We were like two people calling to each other across a canyon, but neither could hear the other's voice." As the initial shock of their reunion began to fade, Margaret's expression grew more troubled. "Elena, I need you to understand what your return means for this community. People have built their understanding of the fire and its aftermath around certain assumptions about who lived and who died. Your survival challenges those assumptions in ways that might make some folks uncomfortable." Elena felt a chill of apprehension at her mother's words. "What do you mean, Mama?" Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street as though expecting to see trouble approaching. There were questions after the fire about how it started and whether everyone had been accounted for properly. Some people blamed your father's carpentry shop, claiming that wood shavings and linseed oil had created a fire hazard. Others pointed fingers at the grain warehouse or the hotel's kitchen. When you were declared dead, it settled certain debates about responsibility and compensation. The implications of what her mother was saying began to dawn on Elena with growing alarm. Her survival didn't just challenge assumptions about the fire's casualties. It potentially reopened questions about liability, insurance claims, and legal settlements that had been resolved years earlier based on incomplete information. Who would be affected if people knew I was alive? Elena asked, though she suspected. The answer would complicate her homecoming even further. Margaret's expression grew darker. Harold Morrison owns most of the businesses that were rebuilt after the fire. He collected insurance money for properties that were destroyed, and he's used that money to become the most powerful man in Millbrook Valley. If questions arise about whether the casualty counts were accurate, it might lead to investigations about whether the insurance payments were legitimate. Elena felt her stomach drop as she realized that her return threatened not just emotional stability but also financial and political power structures that had been built on the foundation of her supposed death. Harold Morrison was a name she didn't remember from her childhood, which suggested he had gained his prominence in the years since the fire, possibly by exploiting the tragedy for his own benefit. "There's more," Margaret continued, her voice heavy with reluctance. "Harold has been courting me for the past 2 years, asking me to marry him. He claims he wants to take care of me and honor your father's memory, but I suspect he's more interested in acquiring this boarding house and the land it sits on. If you're alive, it changes my legal status as Thomas's widow and sole heir." The complexity of Elena's situation was expanding beyond anything she had imagined. Her return didn't just affect her immediate family. It threatened business interests, legal arrangements, and social dynamics that had developed over 15 years of her absence. She was beginning to understand why David Sullivan had warned her to be careful about how she revealed herself to the community. "What should we do, Mama?" Elena asked, feeling overwhelmed by the potential consequences of her homecoming. Margaret was quiet for a long time, clearly wrestling with competing loyalties and fears. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the strength of a woman who had survived tremendous losses and built a new life from the ashes of the old one. "We tell the truth, but we do it carefully and strategically. Some people will welcome your return with joy and celebration. Others will see you as a threat to their interests and stability. We need to be prepared for both reactions." Over the next several days, Elena remained at the Riverside Inn while she and her mother planned how to reveal her identity to the rest of Millbrook Valley. They decided to start with the people who had known Elena as a child and who could vouch for her identity, building a foundation of support before facing those who might oppose her return for financial or political reasons. Their first visit was to Dr. James Patterson, who had delivered Elena at birth and had treated her various childhood injuries and illnesses. Dr. Patterson was now in his 60s, with white hair and gentle hands that shook slightly as he examined Elena in his office behind the medical clinic. He asked her detailed questions about scars, birthmarks, and childhood ailments that only the real Elena would know, and his examination confirmed what Margaret already knew in her heart. "This is definitely Elena Hartwell," Dr. Patterson announced, after an hour of careful scrutiny. "I remember setting her broken wrist when she was 6 years old, and I can see the evidence of how that bone healed. I also recall removing a splinter from her foot the summer before the fire, and the scar is exactly where it should be." Dr. Patterson's medical confirmation provided Elena with official documentation of her identity, but it also created the first crack in the wall of secrecy surrounding her return. The doctor's nurse, Mrs. Abigail Porter, was known throughout Millbrook Valley as someone who enjoyed sharing interesting news with her friends and neighbors. Despite Dr. Patterson's requests for discretion, Elena knew that word of her examination would spread through the community within days. Their next ally came from an unexpected source. Father Michael O'Brien, the Irish priest who had replaced the previous minister after the fire, sought out Elena after hearing rumors about her visit to Dr. Patterson. Father O'Brien was a young man with keen eyes and a direct manner of speaking that reminded Elena of Marcus Bellwether's straightforward approach to problems. "I've heard whispers that Thomas Hartwell's daughter has returned from the dead," Father O'Brien said when he appeared at the boarding house door one evening. "If this is true, it's either a miracle or a deception, and either way, the church should be involved in determining which." Elena found herself liking the priest's candid approach, and she agreed to meet with him privately to discuss her situation. Father O'Brien listened to her story with the careful attention of a man accustomed to hearing confessions and judging the truthfulness of human claims. He asked probing questions about her memories of pre-fire Millbrook Valley, her experiences with the circus, and her reasons for returning after so many years. "I believe you are who you claim to be," Father O'Brien concluded after their lengthy conversation. "Your knowledge of this community's history and your mother's personal details convince me that you're genuinely Elena Hartwell. But I must warn you that your return will challenge many people's faith in their understanding of God's plan and justice." Father O'Brien's support proved invaluable when Harold Morrison made his first direct move against Elena's credibility. 3 days after her identity became known to Dr. Patterson, Elena was approached by Sheriff William Davies, a thick-set man with suspicious eyes who had been appointed to his position through Morrison's political influence. "Miss, I've received reports that someone is impersonating a deceased member of the Hartwell family for fraudulent purposes," Sheriff Davies announced when he found Elena walking near the town square. "I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning." Elena felt her heart race with anxiety, but she maintained the calm demeanor she had learned during years of performing before crowds of strangers. "I'm not impersonating anyone, Sheriff. I am Elena Hartwell, and I have medical documentation from Dr. Patterson confirming my identity." Sheriff Davies seemed unimpressed by her claim. "Anyone can pay a doctor to say whatever they want him to say. I've got concerns about your motives for coming to Millbrook Valley and making these claims right when Mrs. Hartwell is considering remarriage to a prominent businessman." The implication was clear. Harold Morrison was using his influence with law enforcement to discredit Elena and remove her as an obstacle to his plans for acquiring Margaret's property. Elena realized that she was facing exactly the kind of opposition that David Sullivan had warned her about, and that her mother's fears about challenging established power structures were proving well-founded. "I'm willing to answer any reasonable questions about my identity and my reasons for returning home," Elena said carefully. "But I won't be intimidated or harassed because my survival is inconvenient for certain people's business plans." Sheriff Davies' expression hardened at her defiance. "You're walking a dangerous line, young lady. This community doesn't take kindly to outsiders who come here stirring up trouble and making false claims about deceased residents." Elena felt a flash of the same courage that had allowed her to perform death-defying acrobatic feats in front of hostile crowds. "I'm not an outsider, Sheriff. I was born in this town, and I have every right to be here. If you have evidence that I'm committing fraud, then arrest me and present that evidence in court. Otherwise, I suggest you focus your attention on actual criminals rather than harassing innocent citizens." The confrontation with Sheriff Davies marked a turning point in Elena's homecoming. Word of the exchange spread quickly through Millbrook Valley, dividing the community into those who supported her claim to identity and those who viewed her as a threat to stability and prosperity. The situation was further complicated by Harold. Morrison's decision to accelerate his courtship of Margaret, apparently hoping to secure their marriage before Elena's return, could complicate his legal position. Morrison appeared at the boarding house the evening after Elena's confrontation with the sheriff, carrying flowers and wearing his finest suit. He was a man in his 50s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of charm and intimidation. Elena watched from the kitchen window as he spoke with her mother on the front porch, his gestures becoming increasingly animated as Margaret explained Elena's return and her decision to postpone any consideration of remarriage. "Mrs. Hartwell, you're allowing yourself to be deceived by a clever impostor," Elena heard Morrison say, his voice carrying clearly through the evening air. "This woman, whoever she is, has obviously researched your family's history and is exploiting your grief for financial gain. I urge you to reconsider this foolishness before it destroys your reputation in the community." Margaret's response was delivered with quiet dignity but unmistakable steel. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your concern, but I am quite capable of recognizing my own daughter. Elena is alive, she has returned home, and I will not allow anyone to convince me otherwise or to treat her with disrespect." Morrison's facade of genteel concern slipped slightly, revealing the harder nature beneath his polished exterior. "Margaret, you're making a serious mistake. This community has moved forward from the tragedy of the fire, and we've built something prosperous and stable from what was destroyed. Reopening old wounds and questioning settled matters will hurt everyone involved, including you." Elena felt her mother's resolve strengthen in the face of Morrison's veiled threats. "Harold, if prosperity and stability require me to deny my daughter's existence, then perhaps they're not worth preserving. Elena is home, and she's staying home, regardless of how that affects anyone else's plans." After Morrison left that evening, Elena and Margaret sat together in the kitchen, drinking tea and discussing the challenges they would face in the coming days and weeks. It was clear that Morrison would not accept Elena's return gracefully, and that he had both the resources and the motivation to make their lives difficult. "He's going to try to turn the whole town against you," Margaret warned. "Harold has investments and business relationships with almost every successful family in Millbrook Valley. He can put pressure on people in ways that might surprise you." Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar performance costume. She had faced hostile audiences before, people who came to the circus expecting to be disappointed or looking for reasons to criticize. She had learned that the key to winning over skeptics was not just to prove your skills, but to show them something they hadn't expected to see, something that challenged their assumptions and opened their minds to new possibilities. "Then we'll have to show them something they can't ignore or dismiss," Elena said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had spent 15 years learning to captivate and convince audiences. "We'll have to prove not just that I'm Elena Hartwell, but that my return is something this community needs, not something they should fear." The plan that Elena and Margaret developed over the next week was ambitious and risky, designed to address the community's concerns while demonstrating Elena's value as a returning citizen rather than a threat to established order. Elena would organize a public demonstration of her circus skills, using her performance abilities to draw crowds and create opportunities for positive interaction with skeptical townspeople. At the same time, she would share stories of her travels and experiences that could benefit Millbrook Valley's understanding of the wider world and its opportunities for growth and development. The announcement of Elena's public performance created a sensation throughout the community, drawing people who were curious about the supposed dead girl's circus skills, as well as those who hoped to find evidence that she was an imposter. Harold Morrison attempted to have the performance banned on grounds of public safety, but Father O'Brien offered the use of the church grounds, and Dr. Patterson vouched for Elena's mental and physical fitness to perform. As the day of the performance approached, Elena felt the familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness that had always preceded her circus appearances. But this time, the stakes were higher than mere entertainment or artistic expression. This performance would determine whether she could build a place for herself in the community where she had been born, or whether the forces aligned against her would prove too powerful to overcome. The night before her performance, Elena stood in her room at the Riverside Inn, looking out at the lights of Millbrook Valley and thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had traveled thousands of miles and overcome countless obstacles to return home, only to discover that coming home might be the most challenging performance of her entire career. But she had not survived 15 years of circus life by backing down from difficult challenges, and she would not start doing so now. Tomorrow, Elena Hartwell would step into the spotlight once again, not as a circus performer entertaining strangers, but as a daughter fighting for her right to exist in the place where her life had begun. The outcome would determine not just her own future, but the future of everyone whose lives had been touched by the fire that had started this extraordinary story 15 years earlier. The morning of Elena's performance dawned grey and cold, with autumn clouds gathering like vultures over Millbrook Valley. She had spent the night rehearsing her routines in the small confines of her inn-room, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from weeks of travel and trying to ignore the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in her stomach. Through her window, she could see people gathering near the church grounds earlier than expected, their faces bearing expressions of curiosity mixed with skepticism and, in some cases, outright hostility. Elena dressed carefully in her finest performance costume, a creation of emerald silk and gold thread that Sophia had designed to catch and reflect light during outdoor shows. The fabric moved like liquid around her body, and the intricate beadwork sparkled even in the dim morning light filtering through her window. She braided her auburn hair with the same blue ribbons her mother had used when she was 9 years old, a deliberate choice meant to reinforce the connection between the child who had disappeared and the woman who had returned. As she prepared to leave the inn, Elena was intercepted by Mrs. Fletcher, whose expression carried an uncomfortable mixture of sympathy and warning. "Miss Walsh, or whoever you really are, I feel obligated to tell you that there's been talk around town about what's planned for today. Some folks aren't happy about this performance, and they're saying things that make me worry for your safety." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. "What kind of things, Mrs. Fletcher?" The innkeeper glanced around nervously before lowering her voice. "Harold Morrison held a meeting last night at his house. A dozen men attended, including Sheriff Davies and some of the business owners who have the most to lose if questions start being asked about the fire settlement. Word is, they're planning to disrupt your performance and use any excuse to have you arrested or run out of town." The news confirmed Elena's worst fears about the level of organized opposition she faced. Morrison wasn't content to simply discredit her claims or pressure her mother into marriage. He was preparing to use force, if necessary, to eliminate what he saw as a threat to his interests and authority. "Mrs. Fletcher, I appreciate the warning, but I can't back down now. Too many people are depending on me to prove that I am who I claim to be. If I don't follow through with this performance, Morrison wins by default, and my mother loses any chance of happiness or independence." Mrs. Fletcher nodded reluctantly, understanding the impossible position Elena found herself in. "Then be careful, child. And remember that not everyone in this town is against you. There are good people here who want to see justice done, but they're afraid to speak up against Morrison's influence." Eleanor arrived at the church grounds to find a crowd of nearly 200 people gathered in the open area behind the sanctuary. Father O'Brien had set up a makeshift performance space using wooden planks supported by sawhorses, creating a stage elevated enough to allow good visibility from all angles. A rope had been strung between two oak trees at a height of 15 feet, and several pieces of circus equipment that Elena had requested from traveling performers in nearby towns were arranged around the performance area. Margaret stood near the front of the crowd, her face pale but determined, as she watched her daughter prepare for what might be the most important performance of her life. Dr. Patterson was beside her, along with David Sullivan and a handful of other townspeople who had known Elena as a child. But Elena could also see Harold Morrison positioned prominently with his supporters, his expression cold and calculating as he waited for her to begin. Elena climbed onto the makeshift stage and looked out at the assembled crowd, feeling the familiar surge of energy that had always preceded her circus performances. But this audience was different from any she had faced before. These weren't strangers seeking entertainment. These were people whose opinions would determine whether she could rebuild her life in the place where she had been born, and some of them were actively hoping to see her fail or be exposed as a fraud. "Ladies and gentlemen of Millbrook Valley," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd, thanks to years of training in outdoor performance techniques. "My name is Elena Margaret Hartwell, and I am the daughter of Thomas and Margaret Hartwell. 15 years ago, I disappeared during the great fire that devastated our community. Today, I stand before you not as a ghost or an imposter, but as a woman who has traveled the world and learned skills that I hope will honor both my family's memory and this town's spirit of perseverance." A murmur ran through the crowd at her. Words, some voices expressing curiosity and others skepticism. Morrison stepped forward slightly, his voice cutting through the general noise with practiced authority. "Before we're subjected to circus tricks and theatrical displays, I think this community deserves proof that this woman is who she claims to be. Anyone can research a family's history and learn to mimic their mannerisms." Elena had expected this challenge and was prepared for it. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your concerns, and I'm willing to provide whatever proof you consider reasonable. Dr. Patterson has already examined me and confirmed my identity through medical evidence. Father O'Brien has questioned me extensively about my childhood memories and found them consistent with Elena Hartwell's known history. What additional proof would satisfy you?" Morrison's smile was cold and predatory. "If you're really Elena Hartwell, then you'll know things that only she would know. Private family details that wouldn't be found in any public records or newspaper accounts." Margaret started to object to this line of questioning, but Elena gestured for her mother to remain silent. She understood that this confrontation was inevitable, and that avoiding it would only fuel more suspicion and doubt about her identity. "Ask me anything you wish, Mr. Morrison. I have nothing to hide about my identity or my family's history." Morrison had clearly prepared for this moment, and his questions came in rapid succession, each one designed to trip her up or expose gaps in her knowledge. He asked about the layout of the original Hartwell home, about family traditions and private conversations, about childhood injuries and family friends who had moved away before the fire. Elena answered each question with confidence and detail, drawing on memories that had gradually returned over the years and on stories her mother had shared during their reunion. But Morrison's final question was designed to be unanswerable, a trap that would allow him to discredit her regardless of how she responded. Elena Hartwell had a secret hiding place where she kept her most treasured possessions. If you're really her, tell us where that hiding place was and what she kept there. Elena felt her heart sink as she realized that Morrison had chosen a test that depended on information she might never have shared with anyone, even her parents. But as she struggled to remember details about her childhood bedroom and favorite possessions, a memory surfaced with startling clarity. She could see herself at age 8, carefully placing a small wooden horse carved by her father into a gap between 2 loose floorboards under her bed, along with a collection of pretty stones and a letter she had tried to write to her grandmother. In Ireland, under the loose floorboards beneath my bed, Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of genuine memory. I kept Papa's wooden horse, the one he carved to look like the mare that pulled Mr. Henderson's wagon. I also had 7 smooth stones from the creek, 3 white ones and 4 spotted ones that I thought looked like eggs. And a letter I wrote to Grandmama Connolly in County Cork, even though Mama told me we couldn't afford to mail it overseas. The silence that followed Elena's answer was profound and telling. Margaret's face had gone white with shock, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as though struggling to contain powerful emotions. Morrison's confident expression had faltered, replaced by something that might have been uncertainty or growing alarm. That's impossible, Morrison said, but his voice lacked its previous authority. No one knew about Elena's hiding place. She never told anyone about it. Margaret found her voice, and when she spoke it carried the ring of absolute truth. Elena showed me that hiding place the day before the fire. She was worried about keeping her treasures safe, and she wanted me to know where they were in case something happened to her. When we searched through the wreckage of the house, I looked for those floorboards specifically, hoping to find some trace of her possessions. The boards had been burned, but I found the wooden horse among the ashes. I've kept it all these years. The impact of this revelation on the crowd was immediate and dramatic. People who had been skeptical began murmuring among themselves, reassessing their opinions in light of evidence that seemed impossible to fake or research. Dr. Patterson stepped forward to add his medical confirmation to Margaret's testimony, and Father O'Brien spoke about the consistency of Eleanor's memories and the genuine nature of her emotional responses during their conversations. But Morrison was not prepared to concede defeat so easily. As Elena began her planned performance, demonstrating the acrobatic and artistic skills she had developed during her years with the circus, Morrison worked to undermine the growing acceptance she was gaining from the crowd. This proves nothing, Morrison announced during a break between Elena's routines. So what if she knows some family secrets? That just means she's a clever imposter who somehow learned information that should have been private. The real question is what she wants from us and why she's chosen now to make these claims. Morrison's words were designed to shift attention away from Elena's identity and toward her motives, suggesting that her return was part of some larger scheme to defraud the community or disrupt established arrangements. He began spreading accusations that Elena was working with outside interests to challenge property ownership and business agreements that had been settled after the fire. Margaret Hartwell has built a successful business and established herself as a respected member of this community, Morrison continued, his voice taking on the tone of righteous indignation. Now this supposed daughter appears just as Margaret is considering remarriage, threatening to complicate legal arrangements and family inheritances. The timing is suspicious, and the potential for fraud is obvious. Elena felt the crowd's mood beginning to shift as Morrison's accusations found their mark. People who had been impressed by her performance and convinced by her identity proofs were now wondering about her motives and the potential consequences of accepting her claims. The unity of support she had been building was fracturing under the weight of practical concerns about property, money, and legal complications. Sheriff Davies chose this moment to make his move, stepping forward with an official-looking document in his hand. "I have here a warrant for the arrest of this woman on charges of fraud, impersonation, and conspiracy to commit theft. She will be held pending a full investigation of her claims and her background." Elena felt the trap closing around her as she realized that Morrison had been preparing for this moment from the beginning. The public performance had been allowed to proceed, not because her opponents were confident in their ability to discredit her, but because they wanted to create a dramatic scene that would justify her arrest and removal from the community. "On what evidence is this warrant based?" Father O'Brien demanded, his voice carrying the authority of moral outrage. "This woman has provided substantial proof of her identity, and no evidence has been presented to suggest that she's committed any crime." Sheriff Davies seemed uncomfortable with his role, but determined to carry out his orders. "The warrant is based on complaints filed by concerned citizens about potential fraud and the suspicious timing of these identity claims. A proper investigation will determine the truth of the matter." Elena understood that resisting arrest would only provide Morrison with additional ammunition to use against her, but she also knew that once she was in custody, he would have unlimited opportunities to manufacture evidence and pressure witnesses. Her return to Millbrook Valley was about to end in complete failure, just as Morrison had planned from the beginning. But as Sheriff Davies approached Elena with handcuffs, an unexpected intervention changed the trajectory of events. A commotion at the edge of the crowd drew everyone's attention as a group of horsemen approached at full gallop, their urgent pace suggesting that they carried important news or faced immediate danger. The lead rider was a man Elena didn't recognize, but his dress and bearing suggested he was someone of authority from outside Millbrook Valley. He dismounted quickly and approached the crowd with obvious urgency, his eyes scanning the assembled faces until they settled on Elena. "Are you the woman claiming to be Elena Hartwell?" the stranger asked, his voice carrying the crisp accent of someone from the Eastern Territories. Elena felt her heart racing as she wondered whether this new arrival represented additional trouble or unexpected salvation. "I am Elena Hartwell. Who are you, and what business do you have with me?" The stranger reached into his coat and produced an official-looking envelope sealed with red wax. "My name is Robert Carlton, and I'm an attorney representing the estate of Marcus Bellwether. I've been searching for you for months, Miss Hartwell, because you are the sole beneficiary of a very substantial inheritance." "Deal." The words hit Elena like a physical blow, and she staggered slightly as the implications began to sink in. Marcus Bellwether, the man who had saved her life and raised her as his own daughter, had apparently left her everything he owned when he died. But more importantly, the arrival of an attorney with legal documents provided independent verification of her identity and her connection to the circus world she had described. "Marcus is dead?" Elena asked, her voice thick with grief. She had thought she had already processed. "I knew he was ill when I left the circus, but I hoped he might recover." Attorney Carlton's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of sad news, Miss Hartwell. Mr. Bellwether passed away 4 months ago, but he spent his final weeks ensuring that his estate would be properly transferred to you. He left detailed records of how he found you after the fire, including correspondence with officials in multiple territories about his search for your family." The attorney's revelation had a profound impact on the crowd and on the dynamics of Elena's confrontation with Morrison. Here was independent confirmation not only of Elena's identity, but also of her story about being rescued and raised by the circus owner. More importantly, the inheritance made Elena a woman of substantial means, rather than a potential fraud seeking to exploit the Hartwell family's modest assets. Morrison's face had gone red with frustration as he watched his carefully constructed A case against Elena crumbled before his eyes. "This is all very convenient," he said, his voice strained with barely controlled anger. "A mysterious inheritance appears just when this woman needs to establish her credibility. How do we know this attorney isn't part of the same scheme?" Attorney Carlton produced additional documents from his bag, spreading them on the makeshift stage for public examination. "These are certified copies of Mr. Bellwether's will, filed with the territorial court in Wyoming. These are bank documents showing the extent of his estate. And this is a letter he wrote specifically about Elena Hartwell, describing how he found her and documenting his unsuccessful attempts to locate her family in the years following the fire." Margaret stepped forward to examine the documents, her hands shaking as she read Marcus Bellwether's account of finding Elena unconscious in a field and caring for her during her recovery. The letter contained details about Elena's condition and behavior during those early weeks that exactly matched what Elena had told her mother about her lost memories and gradual recovery. "This is real," Margaret announced to the crowd, her voice carrying the weight of maternal certainty. "This man's account matches everything Elena has told me about her experiences. No imposter could have fabricated this level of detail or arranged for this kind of corroborating evidence." Sheriff Davies looked uncertainly between Attorney Carlton's documents and the warrant he held for Elena's arrest. The legal foundation for Morrison's accusations was dissolving rapidly, but Davies was clearly reluctant to directly defy the man who had significant influence over his position and authority. Morrison made one final desperate attempt to salvage his position. "Even if this woman is Elena Hartwell, her return still threatens the stability and prosperity of this community. We've built something good here in the years since the fire, and we can't allow outsiders to come back and disrupt what we've accomplished." The words were a mistake, revealing Morrison's true motivation more clearly than any evidence Elena could have provided. By referring to Elena as an outsider, despite accepting her identity, Morrison exposed his real concern. Not that she was an imposter, but that her return threatened his control over community affairs and property arrangements. Father O'Brien stepped forward with moral authority that commanded attention from everyone present. "Harold Morrison, what you're saying is that a daughter should be denied the right to return to her family and community because her survival is inconvenient for your business interests. That position is morally indefensible and contrary to every principle of Christian charity and family loyalty." The priest's condemnation seemed to break the spell that Morrison had cast over many community members. People who had been wavering in their support for Elena began speaking up in her defense, expressing shame that they had allowed financial concerns to override their compassion for a woman who had survived tragedy and found her way home after 15 years. But Morrison was not finished. As his public support crumbled and his legal strategy failed, he retreated to the kind of personal attack that had served him well in previous conflicts. "This woman has been living with circus people for 15 years, he announced with obvious disgust. "She's been traveling with performers and entertainers, living outside the bounds of decent society. Even if she is Elena Hartwell, she's not the same innocent child who disappeared in the fire. She's been corrupted by years of immoral living, and she has no place in a respectable community." The accusation was designed to appeal to the moral prejudices that many frontier communities held against circus performers and other traveling entertainers. Morrison was betting that even people who accepted Elena's identity would reject her character and lifestyle, providing him with grounds to have her expelled from Millbrook Valley despite her legal right to be there. Elena felt 15 years, of controlled anger and frustration finally boiling over at Morrison's attack on the people who had raised her and loved her when her own community had given her up for dead. The Circus family had been more loyal and supportive than many biological families, and she would not allow Morrison to use their unconventional lifestyle as a weapon against her. "Mr. Morrison," Elena said, her voice carrying the projection and authority she had learned from years of commanding audience attention, "you seem to know a great deal about corruption and immoral behavior. Perhaps you could tell us about the insurance settlements you collected after the fire and whether those payments were based on accurate casualty reports. Or maybe you could explain why you're so eager to marry my mother and acquire her property, just as questions about the fire are being raised again." The counterattack caught Morrison off guard, and his reaction revealed more than he intended. His face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear, and he took a step toward Elena with his hands clenched into fists. "You have no right to question my business dealings or my relationship with your mother. I've done more for this community than you ever will." Attorney Carlton intervened before the confrontation could escalate further. "Actually, Miss Hartwell may have every right to question certain aspects of the fire settlement. Mr. Bellwether's estate includes documentation about his search for Elena's family, including correspondence with insurance investigators who had questions about casualty counts and property assessments. If Elena was incorrectly declared dead, it might affect the validity of claims that were paid based on that assumption." The legal implications of Carlton's statement sent a visible shock through Morrison and his supporters. If Elena's survival cast doubt on the accuracy of other casualty determinations, it could potentially trigger investigations into insurance fraud and property acquisition that had occurred in the aftermath of the fire. Morrison's empire of post-fire prosperity might be built on a foundation of lies and illegal appropriation. Sheriff Davies finally made his decision, choosing legal prudence over political loyalty. "I'm suspending this arrest warrant pending a full review of the evidence and legal implications. Miss Hartwell is free to remain in Millbrook Valley while these matters are resolved." Morrison's face had gone pale as the full scope of his potential exposure became clear. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous as he looked directly at Elena. "You may have won this battle, but you've made powerful enemies. This community will never fully accept you, and I'll make sure you regret coming back here." As Morrison and his supporters dispersed, muttering threats and promises of future retaliation, Elena found herself surrounded by people who had been swayed by the evidence of her identity and the revelation of her inheritance, but the victory felt hollow and temporary. Morrison's final words carried the weight of genuine threat, and Elena understood that her troubles in Millbrook Valley were far from over. Margaret approached her daughter with tears in her eyes and pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. "I'm so proud of you," Margaret whispered. "You showed them the same courage your father always had, and you've honored both his memory and your Circus family." Attorney Carlton joined them with his documents and a concerned expression. "Miss Hartwell, I need to warn you that your inheritance, while substantial, also comes with certain complications. Mr. Bellwether owned property in multiple territories, and some of his business dealings involved people who might not welcome scrutiny of his estate. You may face challenges beyond what you've experienced here today." Elena looked around at the community where she had been born, seeing faces that reflected curiosity, acceptance, skepticism, and hostility in roughly equal measure. Her return to Millbrook Valley had created ripples that would continue spreading outward, affecting lives and relationships in ways she was only beginning to understand. The girl who had disappeared in flames 15 years earlier had returned as a woman shaped by fire of a different kind, but the homecoming she had dreamed, of had become something far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. As the crowd dispersed and evening approached, Elena realized that her real trials were just beginning, and that the forces arrayed against her would require every skill she had learned during her years of survival and performance. The battle for her place in Millbrook Valley was far from over, and the stakes had just grown higher than she had ever thought possible. 3 days after the confrontation at the church grounds, Elena woke to the acrid smell of smoke drifting through her window at the Riverside Inn. Her first thought was of the fire that had changed everything 15 years earlier, and she bolted, upright, with her heart hammering against her ribs. But this smoke was different, thinner and more localized, carrying the scent of burning wood and paper rather than the consuming heat of a building ablaze. Elena dressed quickly and rushed outside, to discover that the source of the smoke was her mother's boarding house. Not the main structure, which remained intact and undamaged, but the small outbuilding where Margaret stored supplies and kept records for her business. The building was completely engulfed in flames, and by the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived with their hand-pumped engine, nothing remained but a pile of smoldering timber and ash. Margaret stood in her nightgown and shawl, watching 15 years of careful record-keeping disappear into the morning air. Her face was pale but composed, bearing the expression of someone who had survived worse disasters and learned to endure whatever came next. But Elena could see the tremor in her mother's hands, and the way she kept glancing toward the windows of the main house, as though expecting the flames to spread, despite the careful distance between the buildings. "Was anyone hurt?" Elena asked as she reached her mother's side, scanning the crowd of neighbors and volunteers who had gathered to help fight the fire. Margaret shook her head, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass, but by the time I looked outside, the building was already fully involved. There was nothing anyone could do except prevent the fire from spreading to other structures." Sheriff Davies arrived as the last of the flames were being extinguished, his expression grim as he examined the charred remains of what had been a substantial storage building. He walked around the perimeter of the destruction, making notes in a small book and occasionally picking up pieces of debris for closer examination. When he approached Margaret and Elena, his manner was more professional than friendly. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to ask you some questions about what happened here," Davies said, his tone carrying an undercurrent of suspicion that made Elena's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Do you have any idea how this fire might have started?" Margaret's response was carefully measured. "I was awakened around 3 o'clock by the sound of glass breaking. When I looked out my bedroom window, I could see flames coming from the storage building. I immediately began waking my boarders and preparing to evacuate the main house if necessary." Davies scribbled notes as Margaret spoke, but his attention seemed focused on details that had nothing to do with firefighting or safety concerns. "Mrs. Hartwell, what exactly was stored in that building? Were there any materials that might have made the fire burn more intensely or spread more quickly?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Elena detected something calculating in Davies's manner that suggested he was fishing for specific information rather than conducting a routine investigation. Margaret apparently sensed the same thing, because her answer was notably brief and careful. "Business records mostly. Ledgers, correspondence, receipts, some cleaning supplies and linens for the boarding house. Nothing that should have caused such an intense fire." Davies nodded as though her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to be frank with you. This fire has all the characteristics of deliberate arson. The intensity of the blaze, the speed with which it consumed the building, and the fact that it started in the middle of the night all suggest that someone set this fire intentionally." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. If Davies was suggesting arson, it meant someone had deliberately destroyed her mother's property, and the timing made it obvious that the fire was connected to Eleanor's return and her confrontation with Harold Morrison. But Davies' next words revealed that his investigation was taking a direction that neither Eleanor nor Margaret had anticipated. Given the recent disputes about property ownership and inheritance that have arisen since your daughter's return, I have to consider the possibility that this fire was set to destroy evidence that might complicate certain legal claims. Davies continued, his eyes fixed on Elena rather than Margaret. Mrs. Hartwell, were there any documents in that building that related to your late husband's estate or to property transfers that occurred after the original fire? Margaret's face went pale as she understood the implication of Davies' questions. He wasn't investigating Morrison or his supporters as potential arsonists. He was building a case that Eleanor had set the fire herself to destroy records that might contradict her claims about her identity or her family's assets. Sheriff Davies, are you suggesting that my daughter burned down my storage building? Margaret asked, her voice sharp with indignation. Elena has been staying at the Riverside Inn, and she had no knowledge of what documents I kept in that building or why they might be important. Davies shrugged with apparent reluctance, as though he regretted having to pursue such an unpleasant line of investigation. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm just following the evidence where it leads. Your daughter stands to inherit a substantial sum from the circus owner's estate, but those inheritance rights might be complicated if questions arise about her legal status as Thomas Hartwell's daughter. Destroying records that might contradict her claims would be a logical step for someone engaged in a long-term fraud. Elena felt rage building in her chest as she realized that Morrison had anticipated her temporary victory and had already moved to the next phase of his campaign against her. The arson had been designed not just to destroy potentially damaging records, but to provide grounds for accusing Elena of criminal activity that would justify her arrest and removal from the community. Sheriff, that's the most ridiculous theory I've ever heard, Elena said, her voice carrying the projection techniques she had learned from years of outdoor performance. Why would I destroy documents that might prove my identity and my family's history? And how exactly do you think I managed to set this fire from my room at the inn without anyone seeing me leave or return? Davies had clearly prepared answers for these obvious questions. Miss Hartwell, or whoever you are, circus people are known for their ability to move quietly and perform feats that seem impossible to ordinary folks. As for why you might destroy family records, perhaps those documents contained information that contradicted your claims about when and how you disappeared. The accusation was based on prejudice and assumption rather than evidence, but Eleanor could see that Davies was prepared to present it as a legitimate theory supported by her circus background and the convenient timing of the fire. Morrison had found a way to turn her greatest strengths into apparent evidence of guilt, using her acrobatic skills and unconventional upbringing as proof of criminal capability. Attorney Carlton, who had remained in Millbrook Valley to help Elena navigate the legal complexities of her inheritance, arrived at the scene as Davies was outlining his theory about Elena's involvement in the arson. Carlton listened to the sheriff's accusations with the calm attention of someone accustomed to evaluating evidence and legal arguments, but his expression grew increasingly skeptical as Davies spoke. Sheriff, I'm curious about the timeline of your investigation, Carlton said when Davies finished presenting his case. When exactly did you determine that this was arson, and what specific evidence supports that conclusion? Davies seemed uncomfortable with the attorney's direct questioning. The investigation is ongoing, but the characteristics of the fire strongly suggest deliberate ignition. The rapid spread and intense heat are consistent with the use of accelerants. Carlton pulled a pocket watch from his vest and checked the time. It's now 8:30 in the morning, and the fire was reported Around 3 o'clock. You've had 5.5 hours to investigate, yet you're already prepared to accuse Miss Hartwell of arson, based on speculation about her motives and abilities. That seems remarkably quick for such a serious accusation. The attorneys pointed. Questions were attracting attention from the neighbors and volunteers who had gathered to help with the fire. Elena could see people looking back and forth between Davies and Carlton, clearly wondering whether the sheriff's investigation was being conducted properly or whether he was rushing to judgment for political reasons. Davies bristled at the challenge to his professional competence. "Mr. Carlton, I've been investigating crimes in this territory for 8 years, and I know arson when I see it. The fact that you're defending someone who benefits from this fire doesn't change the evidence." Carlton smiled with the confidence of someone who had practiced law in multiple territories and dealt with corrupt officials before. "Sheriff, I'm not defending anyone. I'm simply asking you to explain how you've reached such specific conclusions so quickly, and whether your investigation has considered other possible suspects who might have motives for targeting Mrs. Hartwell's property." The suggestion that other suspects should be investigated clearly made Davies uncomfortable, and his response revealed more about his loyalties than he probably intended. "Mr. Carlton, I'm not going to waste time chasing shadows when the most obvious suspect is standing right in front of me. This woman appears in our community claiming to be someone who died 15 years ago, threatens to disrupt property arrangements and business relationships, and then conveniently a fire destroys records that might expose her fraud. The pattern is clear to anyone willing to see it." Elena realized that Davies had no intention of conducting an honest investigation. His mind was already made up, and he was simply gathering whatever evidence he could to support a predetermined conclusion. Morrison had probably promised him rewards for eliminating Elena as a threat, and Davies was prepared to abuse his authority to deliver the results Morrison wanted. But Carlton wasn't finished with his questioning. "Sheriff, since you mention business relationships and property arrangements, perhaps you could tell us whether you've investigated Harold Morrison's whereabouts last night. After all, he's expressed considerable hostility toward Miss Hartwell, and he certainly has motives for wanting to eliminate evidence that might complicate his plans to acquire Mrs. Hartwell's property through marriage." Davies' face flushed, red with anger at the suggestion that Morrison should be considered a suspect. Harold Morrison is one of the most respected businessmen in this territory. The idea that he would resort to arson is offensive and completely without foundation. The sheriff's defensive reaction to any mention of Morrison as a potential suspect confirmed what Elena had already suspected about his loyalties and objectivity. Davies wasn't interested in finding the truth about the fire. He was interested in protecting Morrison's interests and eliminating Elena as a threat to the established power structure. Father O'Brien arrived at the scene in time to hear Davies' passionate defense of Morrison, and the priest's expression suggested that he had drawn his own conclusions about the sheriff's objectivity. "Sheriff Davies, I hope you're not allowing personal relationships to interfere with your professional duties. A proper investigation should consider all possible suspects and motives, regardless of their social standing in the community." Davies turned his anger toward the priest with obvious frustration. "Father O'Brien, I don't need lectures about professional duty from someone who's already declared his support for this woman's claims. Maybe you should worry about your own responsibilities instead of questioning mine." The confrontation between Davies and the two most educated men in the community was attracting more attention and creating exactly the kind of public spectacle that Elena suspected Morrison wanted to avoid. Davies seemed to realize that his defensive reactions were undermining his credibility, and he attempted to regain control of the situation by returning to his official authority. "Miss Hartwell, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of arson," Davies announced, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say may be used against you in a court of law." Elena felt the trap closing around her once again, but this time she was prepared for Morrison's tactics. She had spent the past 3 days thinking about his threats and planning for the possibility that he would escalate his campaign against her. She was not going to allow herself to be locked in a jail cell while Morrison manufactured evidence and pressured witnesses. "Sheriff Davies, I invoke my right to legal counsel," Elena said clearly, making sure her words were heard by everyone present. "Mr. Carlton represents my interests, and I demand that he be allowed to accompany me to ensure that my rights are respected." Davies seemed frustrated by Elena's knowledge of legal procedures, probably hoping that her circus background would leave her ignorant of her rights under territorial law. "Fine, but don't think having a lawyer is going to save you from the consequences of your actions." As Davies moved to place Elena under arrest, a commotion at the edge of the crowd drew everyone's attention. A rider was approaching at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and his manner suggesting urgent news. The man dismounted quickly and scanned the assembled crowd until his eyes settled on Attorney Carlton. "Mr. Carlton, I've been searching for you since yesterday," the rider announced, his voice breathless from hard travel. "There's been a development in the Bellwether estate that requires immediate attention, and Miss Hartwell needs to be present for legal proceedings in the territorial capital." Carlton's expression showed surprise but not confusion, as though he had been expecting some kind of complication, but not necessarily this particular one. "What kind of development, Mr. Patterson?" The rider, who Elena now realized must be another attorney or legal assistant, produced an official-looking document from his saddlebags. "A challenge to the will has been filed by Marcus Bellwether's brother, claiming that Miss Hartwell exercised undue influence over the deceased and that the inheritance should be invalidated. The territorial court has scheduled an emergency hearing, and Miss Hartwell's presence is required within 48 hours. Elena felt her heart sink as she realized that Morrison's campaign against her had expanded beyond Millbrook Valley. Somehow, he had managed to contact Marcus Bellwether's surviving relatives and convince them to challenge the inheritance that had provided independent verification of Elena's identity and story. If she lost the inheritance, she would also lose the legal standing and financial resources she needed to defend herself against Morrison's other accusations. Sheriff Davies seemed pleased by this new development, apparently viewing it as additional evidence that Elena was involved in some kind of elaborate fraud. "Well, Miss Hartwell, it sounds like your circus friend's generosity is being questioned by people who knew him better than you did. Maybe that inheritance isn't as legitimate as you claimed." Carlton studied the legal documents with the careful attention of someone evaluating complex evidence. "Sheriff Davies, these proceedings have no bearing on Miss Hartwell's legal status here in Millbrook Valley. She's still entitled to due process under territorial law, regardless of what happens with the inheritance." Davies shrugged with apparent indifference. "Maybe so, but she's still under arrest for arson, and I'm not releasing her to travel to the territorial capital until this investigation is complete." Elena realized that Davies was using the arson charges to prevent her from defending her inheritance, which would eliminate both her financial resources and the corroborating evidence that Marcus Bellwether's estate provided about her identity and background. Morrison had orchestrated a two-pronged attack designed to destroy her credibility while she was imprisoned and unable to defend herself. But Elena had not survived 15 years of circus life by accepting defeat when the odds were stacked against her. She had learned that sometimes the most effective response to overwhelming force was not direct confrontation, but unexpected maneuver that changed the entire dynamic of a conflict. "Mr. Carlton, What would happen if I chose not to contest the inheritance? Elena asked, her question surprising everyone present, including the attorney. Carlton looked puzzled by her apparent willingness to abandon a substantial fortune. Miss Hartwell, if you don't appear to defend the will, the court would likely rule in favor of the challenge and award the estate to Marcus Bellwether's brother. You would lose everything he left you. Elena nodded, as though this outcome was exactly what she had expected. And if I renounced any claim to the inheritance voluntarily, that would eliminate any questions about my motives for returning to Millbrook Valley, wouldn't it? I couldn't be accused of fraud if I wasn't trying to claim money that didn't belong to me. The logic of Elena's reasoning was apparent to everyone present, and Davies seemed uncertain about how to respond to her willingness to sacrifice the inheritance that he had been using as evidence of her fraudulent intentions. If Elena voluntarily gave up her claim to Marcus Bellwether's estate, it would undermine the foundation of accusations about her motives, while also demonstrating her commitment to proving her identity through other means. Margaret spoke for the first time since Davies had announced his intention to arrest her daughter. Elena, you don't have to give up what Marcus left you. He wanted you to have those resources, and you've earned them through 15 years of loyalty and hard work. Elena looked at her mother with love and determination. Mama, I didn't come home for money. I came home to find my family and rebuild connections that were broken by tragedy. If giving up the inheritance proves that my motives are pure and forces people to judge me based on who I am rather than what I might gain, then that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. Father O'Brien stepped forward with obvious admiration for Elena's decision. Miss Hartwell, your willingness to sacrifice personal gain for the sake of truth and justice honors both your circus family and your biological family. This is exactly the kind of moral courage that this community needs to see. Davies seemed frustrated by the positive reaction Elena's decision was generating from the crowd. Her willingness to give up a substantial inheritance to prove her integrity was making his accusations of fraud seem petty and vindictive rather than legitimate. Morrison's carefully constructed case was beginning to crumble under the weight of Elena's unexpected moral choices. But Elena wasn't finished with her strategic maneuvering. Sheriff Davies, since I'm renouncing any claim to the Bellwether inheritance, the only remaining question is whether I'm actually Elena Hartwell. I propose that we settle this matter once and for all through a test that no impostor could possibly pass. Davies looked suspicious but curious about what Elena had in mind. What kind of test? Elena smiled with the confidence of someone who had spent years perfecting performances that seemed impossible to ordinary observers. Take me to the site where our original house stood before the fire. If I'm really Elena Hartwell, I should be able to show you exactly where my secret hiding place was located, even though the building was completely destroyed. No amount of research or preparation could give an impostor that kind of precise knowledge. The proposal was brilliant in its simplicity and directness. Either Elena could locate her childhood hiding place with the accuracy that only genuine memory could provide, or she would be exposed as a fraud in a way that no legal maneuvering could overcome. Davies couldn't refuse such a test without appearing to be avoiding evidence that might contradict his predetermined conclusions. Margaret's face showed concern about Eleanor's willingness to stake everything on a test that depended on memories that might have been damaged by her childhood trauma. Elena, are you certain you remember exactly where the house stood? 15 years is a long time, and the entire area was cleared after the fire. Elena nodded with more confidence than she actually felt. Her memories of the house layout were clear, but not necessarily precise enough to locate specific floorboards in a field where no building had stood for 15 years. But she had noticed something during her walks around Millbrook Valley that might provide the accuracy she needed to pass Davies's test. The procession to the site of the original Hartwell home included nearly 50 people who had been drawn by curiosity about Eleanor's bold proposal. The lot where the house had stood was now an empty field, covered with grass and wildflowers, showing no obvious signs that a building had ever existed there. But Elena had observed that the town's layout had remained essentially unchanged since her childhood, and she'd been using landmark buildings to orient herself and refresh her memories of the area. Elena stood in the approximate center of the lot and closed her eyes, visualizing the house as it had existed when she was 9 years old. She remembered the front door facing Elm Street, the kitchen window that had looked toward the Henderson property, and the back door that had led to her father's workshop. Using these reference points, she began walking toward where her bedroom would have been located. The crowd followed in silence as Elena paced off distances and adjusted her position based on her memories of the house's proportions. She was acutely aware that her credibility and freedom depended on her ability to translate childhood memories into precise physical locations, but she forced herself to trust the mental images that had remained clear despite the trauma she had suffered. When Elena reached the spot where she believed her bedroom had been located, she knelt down and began examining the ground for any traces that might remain from the original foundation. Her fingers found what felt like a depression in the earth, a rectangular outline that might have marked where the building's foundation stones had been removed after the fire. "This is where my bedroom was," Elena announced, with as much confidence as she could muster. "The hiding place was under loose floorboards near the foot of my bed, which would put it approximately here." Elena moved to a position about 6 feet from the foundation outline and began carefully examining the ground. For several minutes, she found nothing that looked different from the surrounding earth, and she could feel the crowd's skepticism growing as her search continued without results. But then her fingers encountered something that made her heart race with excitement. There, barely visible beneath the grass and accumulated soil of 15 years, was a depression in the earth that exactly matched the dimensions of floorboards. More importantly, when Elena brushed away the surface dirt, she could see pieces of charred wood that had been too deeply buried to be completely consumed by fire or removed during the cleanup. "Sheriff Davies, would you help me dig here?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I think we're about to settle this question once and for all." Davies reluctantly borrowed a shovel from one of the volunteers and began carefully excavating the area Elena had identified. Within minutes, his digging revealed a small cavity in the earth that had been protected from fire by the floorboards. Above it, and there, preserved by the same earthen protection that had saved them from flames, were the treasures that 9-year-old Elena had hidden beneath her bedroom floor. The wooden horse, carved by her father, was blackened with age and smoke, but still recognizable as the careful work of a skilled craftsman. The smooth stones from the creek were exactly as Elena had described them, 3 white ones and 4 spotted ones that had caught a child's fancy. And wrapped in an oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and decay was the letter Elena had written to her grandmother in Ireland, addressed in a child's careful handwriting to Grandmama Connolly, County Cork. Margaret sank to her knees beside the excavated hiding place, tears streaming down her face as she picked up the wooden horse her husband had carved for their daughter. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking with 15 years of accumulated grief and joy. "She came home. Our little girl came home." The silence that followed was profound and reverent, broken only by Margaret's quiet sobs and the sound of wind moving through the grass. Every person present understood that they had witnessed something that transcended legal proceedings or property disputes. They had seen proof of identity that no imposter could have provided, evidence of love and memory that connected past and present in ways that made arguments about fraud or deception seem petty and meaningless. Sheriff Davies stared at the recovered treasures with an expression that suggested his entire worldview was being challenged. The case he had built against Elena was based on assumptions about her motives and identity that had just been proven completely wrong. But Elena could see that Davies was struggling to accept evidence that contradicted everything Harold Morrison had told him to believe. "This doesn't prove anything," Davies said finally, his voice lacking conviction. "These items could have been planted here by someone who knew about the hiding place and wanted to support this woman's claims." Father O'Brien looked at Davies with undisguised disgust. "Sheriff, your suggestion that someone has been maintaining an elaborate deception for 15 years, including burying evidence in a field and waiting for exactly the right moment to retrieve it, is beyond ridiculous. You're allowing your personal loyalties to override your professional judgment." Elena stood slowly, holding the letter she had written to her grandmother when she was 9 years old. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the childish handwriting was clear and unmistakable. She opened the letter carefully and began reading aloud the words she had written 15 years earlier. "Dear Grandmama Connolly, Mama says you live far away across the ocean where everything is green and beautiful. I wish we could visit you, but Papa says it costs too much money to travel so far. I am learning to read better, and Mama is teaching me to sew. Papa made me a horse from wood, and it looks just like Mr. Henderson's mare. I hope you are well and not too lonely. Love, Elena Margaret Hartwell." The simple words of a child's letter carried more power than any legal document or official testimony. They spoke of family connections and innocent love that no fraud could replicate, of memories and relationships that had been interrupted by tragedy but never truly broken. Eleanor looked around at the faces of the people who had gathered to judge her, seeing acceptance and belief where there had been suspicion and doubt. But Davies was not prepared to concede defeat, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. "I still maintain that this woman is involved in the arson that destroyed Mrs. Hartwell's storage building. The fire was deliberately set, and she had both motive and opportunity." Attorney Carlton stepped forward with the authority of someone who had been observing the proceedings with professional interest. "Sheriff Davies, I think it's time you knew something about the Bellwether inheritance that might change your perspective on Miss Hartwell's supposed motives." Davies looked suspicious but curious as Carlton produced additional documents from his bag. "What are you talking about?" Carlton spread the papers on a makeshift table created by balancing a board across 2 wooden crates. "These are detailed financial records from Marcus Bellwether's estate, including documentation of his business dealings over the past 20 years. Sheriff, did you know that Harold Morrison has been corresponding with Bellwether's brother for the past 6 months, offering to purchase certain circus properties and performance rights?" Elena felt her blood run cold as the implications of Carlton's revelation began to sink in. Morrison's challenge to her inheritance wasn't just an attempt to eliminate her financial resources. It was part of a larger scheme to acquire valuable circus properties that would become available if Elena's claim to the estate was invalidated. Davies seemed confused by this information. "What does Morrison's business correspondence have to do with the arson investigation?" Carlton smiled with the satisfaction of someone revealing a carefully hidden truth. "Sheriff, Harold Morrison knew about Elena's inheritance weeks before she returned to Millbrook Valley. He's been planning to challenge the will and acquire circus properties for his own investment portfolio." Elena's return threatened those plans, so he's been systematically working to discredit her and drive her away from the community. The attorney's revelation reframed everything that had happened since Elena's return in terms of Morrison's business interests rather than legitimate concerns about fraud or community stability. Morrison had orchestrated Elena's persecution not to protect Millbrook Valley from deception, but to protect his own financial schemes from legitimate competition. Elena looked at Sheriff Davies with new understanding of his role in Morrison's plans. "Sheriff, how much is Harold Morrison paying you to ignore his crimes and focus on mine?" Davies' face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "I don't take bribes, and I resent the implication that I'm not conducting an honest investigation." Father O'Brien stepped forward with moral authority that carried more weight than legal arguments. "Sheriff Davies, if you're truly conducting an honest investigation, then investigate Harold Morrison's whereabouts last night. Question him about his correspondence with Marcus Bellwether's brother. Examine his financial motives for wanting Elena discredited and driven away." Davies looked around at the crowd of people who were waiting for his response, seeing faces that reflected growing understanding of Morrison's manipulation and their own sheriff's complicity in corruption. The weight of public opinion was shifting against him, and Elena could see that he was beginning to realize that his blind loyalty to Morrison had compromised his professional credibility. "I'll investigate all leads and suspects," Davies said finally, his voice lacking enthusiasm. "But I'm not dropping the charges against Miss Hartwell until I'm satisfied that she wasn't involved in the arson." Elena felt a mixture of frustration and determination as she realized that Davies would continue pursuing Morrison's agenda even in the face of overwhelming evidence of his corruption. But she had accomplished something important today. She had proven her identity beyond any reasonable doubt, and she had exposed Morrison's true motives to the community that would ultimately judge both of them. The crowd began to disperse as the afternoon sun moved toward the western mountains, but Elena remained at the site of her childhood home with her mother and the precious artifacts they had recovered from her secret hiding place. The wooden horse felt familiar in her hands, connecting her to memories of her father's love and craftsmanship that had survived 15 years of separation and uncertainty. Margaret held the letter Elena had written to her grandmother, reading and rereading the simple words that proved her daughter's identity more conclusively than any legal document. "Elena, your father would be so proud of how you've handled this situation. You've shown the same courage and integrity that made him such a good man." Elena felt tears threatening at the mention of her father, but she forced them back. She had work to do and battles to fight before she could allow herself the luxury of grief. Morrison's campaign against her was far from over, and she needed to prepare for whatever moves he would make next. As they walked back toward the boarding house, Elena noticed that many of the townspeople who had witnessed her vindication were looking at her with new respect and acceptance. Children who had been warned to stay away from the strange circus. Women were now approaching with curiosity and wonder, asking questions about her travels and the amazing things she had seen during her years away from home. But Elena also noticed that some faces remained hostile and suspicious, belonging to people whose interests were tied to Morrison's success and who would continue to oppose her regardless of evidence or proof. The battle for her place in Millbrook Valley was far from over, and the most dangerous confrontation still lay ahead. That evening, as Elena prepared for what she suspected might be her last night of freedom before Morrison made his next move, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened girl who had disappeared in flames 15 years earlier had become a woman capable of facing down corrupt officials and exposing elaborate deceptions. But the greatest test of her strength and courage was still to come, in a final confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone who had chosen to stand with her against the forces of greed and corruption that threatened to destroy everything good about Millbrook Valley. Elena woke before dawn on what would prove to be the most consequential day of her return to Millbrook Valley. Through her window at the Riverside Inn, she could see unusual activity in the streets below. Groups of men were gathering near the town square, their voices carrying an undercurrent of tension that suggested something significant was about to unfold. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, where Mrs. Fletcher was waiting with news that would change everything. "Elena, dear, there's been a development overnight that you need to know about," Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Harold Morrison left town before sunrise, heading west with several loaded wagons and a small group of men. Word is spreading that he's abandoned his businesses and fled, rather than face questioning about the arson and his dealings with the Circus inheritance." Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at this news. Morrison's flight suggested that Attorney Carlton's revelation about his correspondence with Marcus Bellwether's brother had exposed criminal activity that made remaining in Millbrook Valley too dangerous for him. But Elena also understood that desperate men often made desperate choices, and Morrison's departure might not represent the end of her troubles. Her concerns proved justified when Sheriff Davies appeared at the inn's front door an hour later, accompanied by 2 federal marshals, whose presence immediately elevated the situation beyond local politics and personal vendettas. Davies looked haggard and defeated, as though he had spent the night grappling with the collapse of everything he had believed about Morrison's integrity and his own role in supporting corruption. "Miss Hartwell, these gentlemen need to speak with you about Harold Morrison's business activities," Davies said, his voice lacking its previous authority. "It appears that Morrison's financial dealings extended far beyond what anyone in this community understood." The senior marshal, a weathered man named Thomas Garrett, approached Elena with professional courtesy but obvious urgency. "Miss Hartwell, we've been investigating Morrison's enterprises for several months as part of a broader inquiry into territorial land fraud and insurance manipulation. Your return to Millbrook Valley and the questions raised about the fire casualty reports provided the final pieces of evidence we needed to issue warrants for his arrest." Elena listened with growing amazement as Marshal Garrett explained the scope of Morrison's criminal activities. The businessman had been systematically acquiring properties throughout the territory by manipulating insurance settlements, casualty reports, and legal documentation following disasters like the Millbrook Valley fire. Elena's supposed death had been just one element in a larger pattern of false reporting that had allowed Morrison to claim compensation for properties and assets that had never actually been destroyed. Morrison's correspondence with Marcus Bellwether's brother revealed that he had been planning to challenge your inheritance, not because he doubted your identity, but because he wanted to acquire the Circus properties for a fraction of their actual value. Marshal Garrett continued. When your return threatened to expose his manipulation of the fire records, he escalated his efforts to discredit and eliminate you as a witness. The marshal's explanation reframed Elena's entire experience in Millbrook Valley, revealing that she had inadvertently stumbled into the middle of a criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond personal revenge or local power struggles. Morrison hadn't been protecting community stability by opposing her return. He had been protecting a criminal enterprise that depended on maintaining lies about the fire and its aftermath. Marshal Garrett produced a document from his official case file and showed it to Elena. "Miss Hartwell, we found this in Morrison's abandoned office. It's a forged death certificate for Elena Hartwell, created 3 years after the original fire and backdated to make it appear contemporaneous with the disaster. Morrison used this document to support insurance claims for properties that were supposedly destroyed while searching for your body. Elena stared at the fraudulent death certificate, seeing her own name and fabricated death date rendered in official-looking script that would have convinced anyone who hadn't known the truth. The document represented not just Morrison's criminality, but the systematic way he had profited from tragedy and manipulated the grief of families like hers for financial gain. "There's more," Marshal Garrett said, producing additional documents. Morrison filed insurance claims for damages to properties he didn't own, using the chaos after the fire to acquire land and buildings through fraudulent transfers and forged documentation. Your family's original property was one of several he obtained through illegal means. Margaret, who had arrived at the inn upon hearing about the federal marshal's presence, gasped as she understood the implications of what Marshal Garrett was revealing. "You're saying that Harold Morrison stole our land, that the empty lot where our house stood legally belongs to Elena?" Marshal Garrett nodded gravely. "Mrs. Hartwell, your family's property was fraudulently transferred to Morrison 3 months after the fire, using documentation that claimed both you and your daughter were dead, and that Thomas Hartwell had agreed to the sale before his own death. Since Elena is obviously alive and Thomas never consented to any such transfer, the transaction was completely invalid." Elena felt her world shifting once again as she realized that Morrison's crimes had robbed her family of far more than she had understood. Not only had her disappearance been exploited for insurance fraud, but her family's ancestral property had been stolen through legal manipulation that depended on maintaining the fiction of her death. Sheriff Davies, who had been listening to these revelations with obvious discomfort, finally found his voice. "Marshal Garrett, if Morrison has fled the territory, what happens to his properties and business holdings? And what about the people who worked for him or invested in his enterprises?" Marshal Garrett's expression showed sympathy for the complex situation Morrison's crimes had created for the innocent residents of Millbrook Valley. "Sheriff, the federal court will appoint administrators to manage Morrison's assets while the full extent of his fraud is investigated. Legitimate creditors and employees will be protected as much as possible, but recovery of stolen properties will take priority over other claims." Elena understood that Morrison's flight had created both opportunities and challenges for everyone affected by his criminal activities. While justice would eventually be served and stolen properties returned to their rightful owners, the process would take time and create uncertainty for many families whose livelihoods had been connected to Morrison's businesses. Father O'Brien arrived at the inn as Marshal Garrett was explaining the legal procedures that would follow Morrison's flight. The priest's presence seemed to provide moral weight to the proceedings, and his first words addressed the spiritual implications of what had been revealed about Morrison's character and actions. "It appears that this community has been harboring a wolf in sheep's clothing," Father O'Brien said, his voice carrying both sadness and determination. "We must now focus on healing the damage that Morrison's deceptions have caused and ensuring that justice is served for all his victims." Elena found herself thinking about the broader implications of Morrison's exposure and flight. His criminal activities had touched every aspect of life in Millbrook Valley, from property ownership to business relationships to the basic trust that held the community together. Her return had not just challenged personal assumptions about her identity. It had revealed systematic corruption that had infected the entire social and economic structure of her hometown. Marshal Garrett turned to Elena with a request that surprised her with its scope and importance. "Miss Hartwell, the federal investigation will require detailed testimony about your experiences during and after the fire, your years with the circus, and your interactions with Morrison since your return. Your perspective as someone who was presumed dead, but survive to expose his fraud will be crucial to ensuring that he faces appropriate consequences for his crimes. Elena realized that her role in bringing Morrison to justice would extend far beyond her personal vindication. She would be testifying not just for herself and her family, but for all the other victims of Morrison's crimes throughout the territory. The frightened girl who had disappeared in flames 15 years earlier had become a key witness in a federal criminal case that would impact hundreds of lives. Attorney Carlton, who had been working quietly to protect Elena's interests throughout the crisis, stepped forward with news about the bellwether inheritance that provided another unexpected development. "Miss Hartwell, I've received word from the territorial court that Marcus Bellwether's brother has withdrawn his challenge to the will. Apparently, he was misled by Morrison about the circumstances of your relationship with Marcus and has now learned the truth about Morrison's criminal activities." Elena felt relief flood through her as she understood that the inheritance Marcus had left her was secure and could be used to rebuild her life in whatever way she chose. But more importantly, the withdrawal of the legal challenge validated Marcus's judgment about her character and confirmed that his decision to make her his heir had been based on genuine affection rather than manipulation or undue influence. Margaret approached her daughter with tears in her eyes and pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. "Elena, your father would be so proud of what you've accomplished. You've not only proven your identity and reclaimed your place in this family, but you've exposed corruption that was poisoning our entire community." Elena held her mother tightly, feeling the weight of 15 years of separation finally lifting from her shoulders. She had come home seeking acceptance and belonging, but she had found something far more valuable: the strength to stand up for truth and justice, even when the cost seemed overwhelming. Over the following weeks, as federal investigators worked to unravel the full extent of Morrison's criminal enterprise, Elena found herself becoming an unexpected leader in the community's efforts to heal and rebuild. Her experiences traveling with the circus had given her perspectives on business, education, and community organization that proved valuable in addressing the challenges created by Morrison's fraud. Elena established a school for the children of Millbrook Valley, using techniques she had learned from the diverse performers and educators who had been part of her circus family. She organized cooperative businesses that allowed families to pool resources and reduce their dependence on single powerful individuals like Morrison. Most importantly, she worked with Father O'Brien and other community leaders to rebuild the trust and social connections that Morrison's deceptions had damaged. Margaret's boarding house became a center for these community rebuilding efforts, hosting meetings and providing space for the various projects Elena initiated. The relationship between mother and daughter deepened as they worked together to create positive change, building new memories while honoring the connection that had survived 15 years of separation. 6 months after Morrison's flight, Elena received word that the federal marshals had apprehended him attempting to cross into Mexico with a wagon full of stolen documents and valuables. His arrest ensured that he would face justice for his crimes, and that the legal process of recovering stolen properties could proceed without the complications of a fugitive defendant. The news of Morrison's capture coincided with Elena's decision to make Millbrook Valley her permanent home, using her inheritance from Marcus to purchase properties and establish businesses that would provide stable employment and economic security for the community. She had offers to rejoin circus companies or establish new entertainment enterprises in larger cities, but her heart belonged to the place where her life had begun. Elena married David Sullivan in a ceremony conducted by Father O'Brien in the rebuilt church, surrounded by a community that had embraced her as both a returning daughter and a visionary leader. Margaret stood beside her daughter as matron of honor, holding the wooden horse carved by Thomas Hartwell that had provided the final proof of Elena's identity and the bridge between her past and future. The wedding celebration extended throughout the town, featuring performances by circus friends who traveled from across the territory to honor Elena's new life. But the most meaningful moment came when Elena and David visited the site where her original family home had stood, now marked by a small monument honoring Thomas Hartwell's memory and the healing power of love that survives even the most devastating losses. As Elena looked out over the thriving community that had emerged from the ashes of Morrison's corruption, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had disappeared in flames had returned as a woman capable of inspiring others to rebuild and transform their world. Her homecoming had indeed been more challenging than she could have imagined, but it had also been more transformative and meaningful than her wildest dreams. The circus had taught Elena that the most powerful performances were those that revealed truth and inspired audiences to see possibilities they hadn't imagined before. In Millbrook Valley, she had given the performance of her lifetime, not on a stage, but in the theater of real life, proving that courage, integrity, and love could triumph over deception, corruption, and fear. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.